The courtroom fell into a stunned silence as Judge Frank Caprio leaned forward and uttered the words no one expected. "I'm prepared to dismiss this case right now." Gasps rippled through the audience. Denzel Washington stood quietly, not as the Hollywood legend the world knew, but as a father and a citizen, facing a charge no one saw coming. Then it happened. A young woman stood up in the back, her voice trembling. She clutched a worn letter. This is what he did for us," she said. What followed stunned the courtroom. An avalanche of hidden truths, buried grief, and one of the most powerful moments Judge Caprio's courtroom had ever seen. Stay with us. This is a story of justice, heartache, and a decision that touched a nation. Comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest true stories inside this courtroom. The doors to the municipal courtroom opened with a soft, almost reluctant creak, one that might have gone unnoticed on any other day. But today, all eyes turned. The name on the docket had created a buzz before the session even began, and when the man walked in, the room fell into a curious hush. He wasn't flanked by bodyguards. There were no sunglasses, no cameras trailing behind, no high-powered attorneys at his side. Just a man in his late 50s, with a tired but kind face, wearing a navy sweater that had clearly seen better days, and a pair of jeans that told the story of long days and honest work. The court clerk glanced up. Even he looked momentarily confused before confirming, "Next case, Denzel Washington." A few heads in the gallery tilted, whispers spreading like ripples in a pond. A reporter in the back adjusted her lens, but it only took a few seconds to realize this wasn't that Denzel Washington. This was someone else, someone quieter, humbler, and seemingly weighed down by something far heavier than fame. Judge Caprio leaned slightly forward, peering over his glasses as the man approached the bench. The judge's eyes sparkled with a touch of mischief. "Mr. Washington," he said, a chuckle rising in his voice, "when my bailiff told me Denzel Washington was here this morning, I nearly asked him to get my phone so I could take a selfie. But you look a little different without the Oscars." A ripple of laughter floated through the courtroom, easing the tension just slightly. The man at the center of it smiled, not the beaming grin of a celebrity, but the modest, restrained smile of someone who knew how to laugh at himself. He nodded respectfully toward the bench. "I get that a lot," he said, his voice soft but clear. "But I'm not here as an actor today, Your Honor. I'm here as a dad." That single sentence seemed to change the air in the room. The gallery fell quiet again, sensing that this wouldn't be just another routine appearance over unpaid tickets. There was something deeper here. Judge Caprio's tone shifted. "All right, Mr. Washington, let's take a look at why you're here." The docket was surprisingly long for someone who didn't look like trouble. 14 separate traffic violations, all filed within a 5-month window. They weren't the kind of charges that typically drew media attention or courtroom drama. Expired meters, no parking zones, even one citation for allegedly blocking a fire hydrant. But what stood out wasn't the number of tickets, or even the violations themselves. It was the pattern, all of them issued in the same few streets in a low-income neighborhood of Newark. Same timeframes, same blocks. Judge Caprio scanned the citations and raised an eyebrow. "You've got a bit of a collection here. Care to explain how we got to this point?" Denzel clasped his hands and exhaled slowly. You could almost see the weight resting on his shoulders. This wasn't a man making excuses. This was someone who'd been carrying a load for far too long, waiting for a place where he might finally lay it down. "Your Honor," he began, "I know it looks bad on paper, and I know the rules are the rules. But the truth is, I wasn't trying to break the law. I was just trying to keep a promise I made to my daughter." It was in that moment, just a few minutes into the hearing, that the courtroom understood. This wasn't going to be a simple case about tickets and fines. This was going to be a story about family, struggle, and the quiet, everyday sacrifices that rarely make the news. And Judge Caprio, known for his ability to see beyond the surface, leaned back slightly, folded his hands, and gave Denzel Washington the space he needed to tell his story. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and flipped through the stack of citations laid out before him, like chapters in a book. Each one a snapshot of a moment, a place, a choice. "You've got quite the stack here, Mr. Washington," the judge said, his voice neither harsh nor dismissive, but tinged with curiosity. 14 citations. I assume you're going to tell me there's a reason for all these? Denzel nodded slowly. Yes, Your Honor, there is. I volunteer at a transitional housing shelter over on East Ferry Street, Harmony House. Most of these tickets came from when I was dropping off food, hauling donations, or walking the kids to school buses. It's part of what I do. The court clerk tapped at her keyboard, eyes narrowing. He's right, Your Honor. All 14 violations are within a 2-block radius of Harmony House. Caprio leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench. Harmony House, I know the place, serves families trying to get back on their feet. That's right, Denzel said. Single moms, kids, a few disabled vets. I was one of them once. Now I give back. From the prosecutor's table, Assistant City Attorney Monroe raised an eyebrow. Mr. Washington, if you knew parking was tight in that area, why not use the designated loading zone? Denzel turned to face him respectfully. There isn't one anymore. The city removed it last year when funding got cut. There's one working meter on the block, but it's usually jammed or already taken, and we don't have the kind of resources to circle the block 20 minutes while the food spoils. Caprio tilted his head. You're telling me there's no designated loading zone for a shelter that serves over 50 people? Correct, sir. Not anymore. The prosecutor jotted something in his notebook, but didn't press further. Caprio looked back at the docket. All right. Most of these are expired meter or restricted zone violations. Minor infractions, arguably understandable. But the hydrant citation? That one's a little more serious. Denzel's face grew more solemn. He glanced down, rubbing the back of his neck. That was during a community fire drill. We were helping the kids practice evacuation procedures. We pulled the van up to the curb for a few minutes to offload the emergency kits. It wasn't a smart move. We didn't mean to block anything. He was interrupted by a voice from the gallery. Your Honor, a woman called out, standing respectfully. Caprio looked up. Ma'am, do you have something to add? She stepped forward, clutching a file in her hands. My name is Maribel Contreras. I'm the director at Harmony House. Caprio gestured her to the front. Please. Maribel spoke clearly, her tone gentle but confident. I was present during the drill. The vehicle didn't obstruct the hydrant itself. The fire department was there. They completed their check and had no issues. It was a misunderstanding when the parking enforcement officer came by during the drill and saw the van near the hydrant. But it wasn't blocking it. The prosecutor straightened. We'd like to see documentation. Without hesitation, Maribel handed over the folder. Caprio took it, flipping through the contents. His eyes scanned the pages, pausing briefly at a document bearing the Newark Fire Department letterhead and an official signature. He muttered. This is dated 2 days after the citation, and signed off by the department lieutenant. It verifies that the hydrant was accessible during the drill. He closed the folder gently. That certainly changes things. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Caprio looked back at Denzel. Mr. Washington, the hydrant violation will be dismissed based on this documentation, but that still leaves the issue of the remaining fines. He tapped the bottom of the docket. Over $2,000 in unpaid tickets. Denzel turned his head toward the back of the courtroom. A young man, no more than 17, sat watching. He wore a thermal vest and had medical braces wrapped around his legs. A motorized wheelchair supported him. Denzel gave him a small nod before turning back. "I'm not refusing to pay, Your Honor," he said softly. "But I can't pay it all today. My son—" His voice caught for a second. "He's undergoing weekly treatments for spinal muscular atrophy. Between my work at the shelter and his care, every cent counts." Judge Caprio's expression shifted slightly. Not pity, but understanding. "He's your youngest?" the judge asked. "My youngest boy. Dion, 17. He wants to walk again. We've been saving up for a therapy program that's not covered by Medicaid. Every time I had to choose between paying a fine or paying for his care, well, I chose him." Silence settled like snow over the courtroom. Even the prosecutor was quiet now, the fire in his questions dulled. Caprio took a breath and folded his hands again. "Mr. Washington, thank you for your honesty. It's not every day someone comes in here with a stack of violations and no excuses, just reasons." Denzel nodded, grateful, his eyes flicking back to Dion, who now offered his father a quiet, encouraging smile. "I'm not looking for special treatment," Denzel said. "Just time. I'll pay every dime, if you can give me that." Judge Caprio didn't reply immediately. He just looked at the folder in front of him, the citations, the letters, the medical bills Maribel had also quietly included, and then he closed the folder with care. Because what came next, he knew, was about more than law. It was about justice. Judge Caprio had been reading people for decades. He'd seen all kinds, those trying to dodge responsibility, those drowning in excuses, and those, like Denzel, who carried their burdens quietly. But now something in the room shifted. It wasn't just about the tickets anymore. It was about the reason why. The judge noticed the way Denzel's eyes had drifted to the back again, toward the young man in the wheelchair, who hadn't spoken a word, but whose presence filled the room with silent strength. Caprio leaned in slightly. "Mr. Washington," he asked gently, "who's that young man behind you?" Denzel turned, his eyes briefly welling with something deeper than pride, something sacred. "That's my son, Malcolm," he said, his voice low but resolute. "He's 17, born with spina bifida. My wife and we've spent every dime we've ever had to cover his surgeries, his braces, his care. Some nights we sleep in shifts so one of us can monitor him. And the shelter, it's the only place I can still give back without costing my family a cent." Malcolm, sitting tall in his chair despite his condition, raised one hand in a small wave. His smile lit up the courtroom, unapologetic, unashamed, and radiating pride for his father. The entire courtroom grew still. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt louder now. Caprio's tone softened, his voice barely above a whisper. "I had no idea." There was something in the judge's expression now, a deep sadness, maybe even guilt, that a courtroom had almost reduced this man to a case number. He looked down at the stack of violations again. Somehow, they seemed smaller now, less urgent. In the gallery, people exchanged glances, some covering their mouths. A woman in the front blinked back tears. Even the city attorney shifted in his seat, suddenly unsure of where justice ended and compassion began. Denzel cleared his throat, not to dramatize, but to keep himself steady. "Your Honor, every time I parked where I shouldn't have, it wasn't because I didn't care. It was because I was carrying things, important things. Diapers for the toddlers, space heaters for the winter months when the shelter's heat would cut out, trays of donated meals. I wasn't thinking about fines or ordinances. I was thinking about those kids, about getting in and out fast enough to be back home before Malcolm's leg spasms kicked in. The words weren't rehearsed. They weren't performative. They were simply true, and that's what cut through everyone in the room. One of the jurors, a woman in her 30s wearing a faded cardigan, leaned slightly toward the person next to her and whispered, just loud enough to be heard, "That's the Denzel they don't talk about." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't sarcasm. It was reverence. In that moment, the courtroom didn't see a man who had racked up parking tickets. They saw a father who gave everything, a husband who chose service over sleep, a man who bent the rules not for himself, but for people who had nothing. Caprio sat in silence for a long moment. He looked out at Malcolm, who now seemed to glow with pride for his father, not because of what he had said, but because of who he was. Then Caprio looked back at Denzel. "You've painted a picture today, Mr. Washington," the judge said slowly. "That makes those tickets look a lot different than they did when you walked in. Sometimes the letter of the law forgets the spirit behind it. I think today we need to remember that spirit." A long pause followed, not for drama, but because something sacred had entered the room. Humanity, grace, and the quiet dignity of a man doing the best he could, not for applause, but for love. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, a movement as deliberate as the silence that followed. He rested his hands in front of him, fingers interlaced, the weight of the moment pressing gently on his shoulders. He didn't look at the citations, not anymore. He looked at Denzel Washington, the father, not the actor, the volunteer, not the violator. Then, with the quiet gravity of someone who'd carried the gavel for decades, he closed the folder. The soft thump of the paper echoed in the stillness of the courtroom. "There's the law," Caprio began, his voice steady but reflective. "And then there's justice." The words hung in the air, simple yet seismic. He turned toward the prosecutor, who had gone uncharacteristically quiet. "This court," Caprio continued, "is not just a place where we tally fines or recite penal codes. It's a court of record, but not just record of offenses. We're here to record lives, circumstances, choices made under pressure." He gestured gently toward Denzel. "And in front of us today, we're dealing with a man who's lived a life of quiet public service. No cameras, no headlines, just service." The prosecutor gave a subtle nod. He wasn't ready to concede, but the sharp edge of opposition had dulled to a contemplative silence. Caprio turned back to Denzel, now looking at him with something deeper than professional interest, something personal. "You remind me of my own father," he said softly. "He was the son of Italian immigrants, came here with nothing, worked 3 jobs, mornings in the bakery, nights cleaning offices, weekends laying brick. He never asked for help. He just gave to his family, to the neighborhood, and he never got recognition. But he shaped lives." Denzel swallowed hard. Caprio's eyes were a little brighter now, as if memory had drawn up something long buried, but deeply loved. "And you," Caprio said, pointing gently, "are not standing here for yourself. Every step you've taken, every fine you've received, every sleepless night, has been for something greater. For your son, for other people's children, for a community most of the world never even sees." The courtroom was silent, except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. "I'm torn," Caprio admitted finally, breaking the reverie. "I truly am. Because if I let this slide, if I dismiss this entirely, I risk sending the message that compassion excuses obligation, that if someone has a noble cause, they're above the law, and we can't have that. We shouldn't have that." He paused, letting the principle hang. "But if I hold firm, if I look only at the ledger and not at the man, then I ignore the truth that justice is not one size fits all, that the law, while equal in writing, doesn't always account for the unequal lives we lead. He leaned forward now, voice a touch more vulnerable. Do you see my dilemma, Mr. Washington? I do, Your Honor, Denzel replied quietly. More than you know. The judge exhaled slowly, the weight of years settling on his words. Some cases are simple. Others, they follow me home. They sit with me at the dinner table. They make me wonder if I did the right thing, not just as a judge, but as a human being. He glanced again toward Malcolm, still sitting tall in his wheelchair, still proud. Your son deserves more than a father weighed down by debt for doing good. But he also deserves to grow up in a country where the rules matter, and where people are held accountable, even when it hurts. Caprio shook his head slightly, as if no textbook had prepared him for this. I need more, he said finally, firmly, but not unkindly. If I'm going to make the right judgment, not the easy one, I need the whole picture. Denzel furrowed his brow slightly. More, sir? Caprio nodded. I want to know what you do at that shelter. I want to see the work. I want to hear from people who've been helped, who've been changed by what you do. Not because I doubt you, but because if I'm going to bend the rules, I need to show why. I need something to hold up to anyone who questions this and say, this is why I showed mercy. He looked to the prosecutor. You object? The prosecutor shook his head. No, Your Honor. I think that's fair. Caprio gave Denzel a thoughtful nod. I'm continuing this matter for 30 days. Bring me documentation, testimony, even a letter from your director, Miss Contreras, was it? Maribel rose slightly from the bench and nodded. I want to see the story beyond this courtroom. Then I'll make my ruling. Denzel blinked, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. Caprio raised his gavel, then paused once more. And Mr. Washington? Yes, sir? The judge's voice softened again. Whatever happens, your son is already proud. That counts more than anything I could ever write in a decision. It was supposed to be over. The case had been continued. The gavel had struck. The courtroom had begun to relax. People shuffled slightly, adjusting coats, checking their phones. The rhythm of the room had returned to normal, until it didn't. That's when it happened. A quiet voice, barely louder than a whisper, broke the air. Your Honor, may I speak? All heads turned. In the back row, a young woman, no more than 18, stood with shaky hands, holding a worn, yellowing envelope against her chest. Her voice quivered, but her eyes carried a quiet resolve. Judge Caprio looked over his glasses and gave a gentle nod. Yes, young lady. Come forward. She made her way to the front with slow, careful steps. You could almost hear her heartbeat in the silence. She stood beside Denzel and extended the envelope to the judge with both hands, as if passing something sacred. Caprio opened it. Inside was a folded letter, handwritten, smudged in places where old ink had blurred. He adjusted his glasses and began to read aloud. I was 6 when my mom brought me to Harmony House. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs. I didn't even own a pair of shoes that fit. That first night, I remember crying into a borrowed pillow, wondering if we'd ever be okay again. The next morning, a man walked in with a box. Inside was a Thanksgiving turkey, 3 coats, and 2 backpacks filled with school supplies. He handed them to my mother and said, "This is just the beginning. Don't give up." That man was Mr. Washington. The courtroom grew utterly still. Caprio looked up from the letter, brows furrowed in recognition. You're that little girl? She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Yes, sir. And now I'm in my first year at New York University, on scholarship. I'm studying education because of what he did for me. I never got to thank him. Until now. A soft gasp came from the gallery. A few hands went to mouths. Denzel stood frozen, his jaw slightly clenched, eyes glassy. He hadn't recognized her. She was just a child then. But now, here she was, proof that kindness doesn't disappear. It grows. The judge stared at her for a long moment, then carefully placed the letter beside him on the bench. He was about to speak when another voice rose. "Me too." A middle-aged man stood in the back, lifting his hand. "I was fresh out of rehab, living at Harmony House, when Mr. Washington drove me to my first job interview. Gave me his tie. Told me I could start over." Then another voice. "And me," said an older woman near the front. "He helped my daughter study for her citizenship test." Then another. "He bought shoes for my twins, out of his own pocket." And another. "He stayed up all night building bunk beds for us." 3 people stood. Then 5. Then nearly a dozen. One by one they spoke, not with rehearsed speeches, but with raw, unpolished memories, stories of full bellies, warm coats, rides to job interviews, nights made less cold by space heaters, and dignity restored by a man who never signed his name on the donation slip. A man who never asked for applause. Even the court reporter stopped typing, unable to keep pace with the stories pouring in. The prosecutor turned, mouth slightly open, unsure if he was witnessing a legal hearing or a revival of the human spirit. Judge Caprio sat back slowly, the swell of emotion beginning to overtake even him. His hand covered his mouth briefly as he tried to find words, but they didn't come right away. He glanced at Denzel, who stood surrounded by voices from his past, each one a testament to the quiet legacy he'd left behind without even trying. Caprio exhaled deeply, finally speaking through the emotion that thickened the air. "I asked for the full picture," he said, voice cracking slightly, "and I got it." A ripple of soft laughter and tears moved through the courtroom. No one seemed sure if they should clap, stand, or simply sit with the moment. Denzel wiped his eyes quickly, then looked down at his son Malcolm, who gave him a nod of pure pride, a gesture deeper than any applause. Caprio looked down at the pile of citations once more. It now felt almost absurd. A stack of 25 parking tickets versus years of selfless service and transformed lives. This wasn't a man who broke the rules for convenience. He bent them for humanity. The judge closed the folder for the second time that day, and this time he didn't plan on opening it again. The courtroom had transformed. What began as a routine traffic hearing had unraveled into something far more powerful, something almost sacred. The wood-paneled walls had become the backdrop for a portrait of grace, resilience, and quiet heroism. A legal chamber had become, for 1 hour, a cathedral of human dignity. Judge Frank Caprio sat still, no longer the arbiter of municipal law, but a witness to the hidden lives behind the fines and citations that crossed his bench every day. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses. His eyes, brimming, stared not at the docket, but at the man who had unwittingly turned a courtroom into a sanctuary of compassion. He reached for a tissue, dabbed his eyes, then exhaled through his nose, part grief, part awe. "Mr. Washington," Caprio's voice cracked slightly before he steadied himself. "I've presided over thousands of cases, thousands, some angry, some humorous, some tragic. But what I've seen today is one of the most profound moments I've ever had the privilege to witness." The audience had gone silent again, as if holding on to every breath, afraid that sound itself might break the sanctity of the moment. Caprio turned to the clerk, who stood at the ready, half expecting more legal proceedings. "Madam Clerk," the judge said, clearly and with finality, "motion to dismiss all charges." The clerk hesitated, stunned. "All of them, Your Honor." Caprio nodded without pause. All of them. Every fine, every penalty, every associated fee. The clerk's hand paused above her ledger, processing what she'd heard. This man, Caprio continued, voice unwavering now, owes this city nothing but our gratitude. He has paid in ways we rarely see, in time, in love, in sacrifice. A murmur of approval swept through the courtroom, gentle, reverent, and rising like a tide. Denzel stood still, eyes wide and glossy. For a moment, he seemed frozen in disbelief, as if waiting for the judge to correct himself. But instead, Caprio looked at him with the eyes of a man who had lived long enough to know when something truly mattered. "This country talks about heroes," Caprio said, turning now not just to Denzel, but to the entire room. "We make movies about them. We give them medals and headlines. But the real heroes, too often, live quietly, serve quietly. They don't wear capes or uniforms. They wear plain navy sweaters and walk into courtrooms alone, not seeking vindication, just doing what they can." A soft sound of emotion came from behind Denzel. Malcolm, his son, wheeled himself forward. With slow, deliberate movement, he took his father's hand, strongly, firmly, and held it like a lifeline. Denzel bowed his head, the tears finally flowing freely. I didn't do it for this," he whispered, voice catching. "I did it because I had to." Caprio leaned slightly forward. "And that, Mr. Washington, is exactly why you deserve this. True service never asks for recognition, but it's our responsibility to give it anyway." Then, something remarkable happened. The entire gallery rose to their feet. Some clapped, some wept. A few simply placed hands over their hearts. It wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a tribute. Even the prosecutor, reserved and rule-bound, nodded his head respectfully, acknowledging what logic alone couldn't explain. Caprio lifted his gavel, but this time not to assert order. There was no scolding, no correction, no warning. This strike was ceremonial. A gavel to honor, not to punish. Case dismissed, with honor. The gavel fell. The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't loud. It was rich, deep. A rising chorus not of celebration, but of recognition. Denzel turned to his son, squeezed his hand, and whispered something inaudible. Malcolm nodded, eyes glistening with pride that no wheelchair could diminish. Judge Caprio stood slowly and approached the edge of the bench. He extended his hand to Denzel. "On behalf of this city," he said as they shook, "thank you for all the unseen things you've done, for all the lives you've touched." Denzel looked at him, voice barely audible. "I never thought anyone would notice." Caprio smiled. "They did today, and they would never forget." As Denzel and Malcolm turned to leave, this time not in silence, but accompanied by admiration, people reached out. Some to shake his hand, some to hug him, some just to say, "Thank you." The doors opened, just as they had an hour ago. But the man who walked out wasn't just the father in the plain sweater. He was the face of what's best in us all. And for once, the world saw it. And just like that, a courtroom became more than a chamber of justice. It became a sanctuary of truth. Denzel Washington, known worldwide for his roles, reminded everyone that the truest character isn't played on screen. It's lived in silence. The law had its say, but compassion had the final word. In a world quick to judge and slow to listen, this case became a national reminder that sometimes the real heroes are the ones who show up quietly and just never stop giving. Judge Caprio later said, "Some judgments don't need a gavel, they need a heart." The case inspired a wave of donations to shelters across the country. Harmony House expanded. And Malcolm, well, he started a scholarship fund for kids like him, all sparked by one father's traffic tickets and a courtroom's willingness to listen. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from? Do you believe compassion has a place in justice? Should stories like Denzel's be the rule, not the exception? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because every week, inside this courtroom, you'll see the moments that remind us we're all just human, trying to do our best. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and always, always listen deeper.